move on to the next talk by Stephanie Clements from the University of Miami. Her talk is titled Assessing the Conservation Risk of Florida Reef Geckos, the U.S. herpofaunal species most vulnerable to sea level rise.
Awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. Can you hear me and can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. So yeah, I'm Steph Clements. I am a PhD student at the University of Miami in Dr. Chris Searcy's lab. And today I'm going to be talking to you about some of the work that we've been doing with the Florida reef gecko. This is work that I've been doing along with co-authors, fellow graduate students, Emily Powell and Caitlin Mothez, and then of course, my graduate advisor, Dr. Chris Searcy. So a big thank you to them for all of their help throughout this project. So I probably don't need to tell all of you that climate change and sea level rise are a huge threat to biodiversity on a global scale, but that these are especially pronounced threats in low-lying coastal regions, just like here in South Florida. So 10% of our state is at 1 meter or less above sea level, which puts us particularly at risk from sea level rise. So this threatens our native habitats and our native biodiversity. In addition to the threats of climate change and sea level rise, we also have increased human population and increasing urbanization, which further threatens our native flora and fauna. And so one of these really cool and unique habitats that we have here is the hardwood hammock. So this is a habitat found here in South Florida, and there is plenty of it at the Deering Estate, which I'll be talking about just in a little bit. And this habitat is home to a lot of our unique flora and fauna, such as the Florida reef gecko. So this is a really cool species. They're actually the only native gecko that we have east of the Mississippi in the United States. So very unique in that aspect. And they're only found within the US here in South Florida. So they're in the counties of Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Broward counties. They are also found in Cuba and in the Bahamas, but the ones that we have here are a separate subspecies and are phenotypically different. So they're also part of the dwarf geckos family. So they're very, very tiny. They're the smallest, members of the dwarf geckos family are the smallest amniotes. And you can see a reef gecko here. They're really tiny, that's someone's finger. And because they're so tiny, about 6 centimeters, they're very hard to find and they're pretty elusive. And so because of this, there's really not a lot known about this species. There had only been 2 papers ever published specifically on the Florida reef gecko up until last month when we published a 3rd paper on them. And so given all of this, they've been listed as least concern from a conservation standpoint, but anecdotally around South Florida, people have been saying that they seem to be less common than they were historically. But again, we don't really know because nobody's really focused on this species. And so given all of this, we wanted to learn a little bit more about the Florida reef gecko and determine whether we should potentially be concerned about them from a conservation standpoint as a really unique component of our Florida fauna. And so to do this, we had several project components. We wanted to conduct surveys to assess their distribution. So we first wanted to go to any historic places where they've been found in South Florida to basically figure out, are they still at these places where we have seen them in the past, or are they actually decreasing across their South Florida range? We wanted to assess their current distribution. So like I said, they're hard to find. And so we figured they might be in additional locations where people just haven't recorded them in the past, but that's just because they're hard to see. So we wanted to search some new sites for them as well. We assessed the amount of habitat that remains available to this species, looked at their future risk from climate change and sea level rise. And then the parts of the project that are still ongoing, we are assessing their microhabitat requirements. And so this is the part that we're doing here at Deering. And then we also are hoping to use a novel technique using terrestrial environmental DNA to detect gecko presence. And so I'm going to start with talking about the historic localities and current distribution in Florida. So for our gecko surveys, for the historic localities, we use GBIF, the Global Biodiversity Information Facility, and downloaded localities where they've been found in the past, and then went back to revisit those places. To assess new locations, we went to any Miami-Dade County and Florida state parks that have tropical hardwood hammock. We know the geckos like the hammock, but we don't know necessarily if they're within all of these hammock parks or not. And so at each of these localities that we went to, we spent 2 person hours searching for the geckos. So these were visual encounter surveys, doing things like looking under palm fronds, flipping logs and rocks, stuff like that. Where we found the geckos, on average, we were finding them within the first 17 person minutes of search time. And so this rapid detection rate indicates that for places where we did not find them, they're either truly absent or at least at a significantly lower abundance or detectability. And so this map here shows the sites that we surveyed. The circles represent the new localities that we went to, and the triangles are places that we revisited that were historic occurrences of the geckos. In red are the sites where they were absent, and in white are sites where we did find geckos. So in total, we searched 58 localities around South Florida, and we detected geckos at 41% of all of those sites that we searched. Out of those 58 localities, 26 of them were historic, so places where the geckos were found before. But out of those historic localities, the geckos were actually absent, or at least we did not detect them, from 35% of those historic localities. So that was concerning, that over a third of the places where they've been found before, we were not seeing these geckos. You may have noticed, I'll go back to the map, that the white seems to be kind of clustered along the coastline. So one thing that we did find is that distance from coast explains gecko presence. So we never found geckos more than 1.2 kilometers from the coast. And on average, we were finding them just 380 meters from the coast. So they seem to be a coastal specialist species based on these surveys. Being in South Florida, of course, we're quite familiar with hurricanes. And so this made us a little concerned about them from a storm surge perspective. So this is without even taking sea level rise into account. This is just based off of current sea levels. We use NOAA's National Storm Surge Hazard Map, which looks at areas that would become inundated or flooded at categories 1 through 5 hurricanes. And so we actually found, looking at that all but 3 of our current localities of geckos could become underwater with a category 3 storm or higher. So that's not great. And then looking towards habitat availability, we were finding geckos in locations that were classified as hammock and as parks/zoos. And the total amount of these habitat types that remains within the 1.2 kilometers from the coast is just 54 square kilometers. And so that's not a lot of habitat. This map in blue is showing the total amount of suitable habitat, but yeah, you can barely see the blue. So I'm going to zoom in for you around Miami and down in the Keys. And so with this, you can see that in addition to there not being a lot of habitat left, what is remaining is also severely fragmented. So this is also concerning for this tiny species that probably can't really travel easily through urbanized areas, that their habitat has very little left and is highly fragmented. Looking towards future risk from climate change, we wanted to compare the risk of sea level rise to the geckos and compare that to all of the other United States herpetofauna, so reptiles and amphibians. And so we again used GBIF for this, and we downloaded the localities for all native reptiles and amphibians in the United States, and then extracted the elevation and the distance to coast for all of these localities, and found the average elevation and distance to coast for each species. And so here you can see, let me see if I can get a pointer. On this here, the red star is the Florida reef gecko. And so they were actually the second least distance from coast of all US herps. The only one found closer to the coast on average was the rimrock crown snake, which is also just here in South Florida. And that one only had 2 occurrences. So that's a little bit hard of a comparison. And then the geckos were also the third lowest elevation of all US herps, and the only ones found at a lower elevation on average were the salt marsh snake and the American crocodile, both of which are, of course, somewhat brackish adapted species that we would anticipate being able to handle sea level rise a bit better than the gecko. And then if we look at the actual amount of gecko habitat and gecko localities that are predicted to be underwater with future sea level rise, basically what we predict right now based off of our current infrastructure and current emissions is that we're committed to about 2.2 meters of sea level rise eventually. And this 2.2 meters of sea level rise will flood 85% of suitable gecko habitat and 79% of the known gecko localities. So that's pretty concerning as well. So to summarize what we know so far about this species, we found that they appear to be extirpated or at least are not detected at over a third of the localities where they were found in the past. They are only found within 1.2 kilometers of the coast and within these 3 counties of South Florida. Their habitat is severely fragmented and only 54 square kilometers remains. And they appear to be the US herp that is most at risk of sea level rise based off of elevation and distance to coast. And the majority of their habitat is predicted to become inundated with sea level rise. And so given all of this and our concern for this species based on these new findings, we wanted to also learn a little bit more about what they need on a microhabitat level. So like I mentioned before, we know that they like hardwood hammocks, but what we don't know is whether they have specific requirements within those hammocks of areas that they prefer to be. And so this part of the project we've been doing at the Deering Estate, being one of the largest areas of tropical hardwood hammock that remains within urban Miami, it's the perfect place for us to be doing this next component of our project. And so this is still ongoing, but what we did is we created a 50 by 50 meter grid across the estate. And then we randomly selected 100 points within that grid at which to put cover boards. So these are 2 by 2 foot pieces of wood that sit on the ground. And the point of this is that the geckos really like refugia. They like to hide under stuff. And so this means that we can keep going back to these boards and looking under these boards to see if we can find geckos there or not. We currently have 81 boards placed across the estate. I mentioned that we picked 100 randomly, but some of those fell within the wetland where we obviously could not put cover boards. And so we have 81 out there right now. And we've been going back and periodically checking these boards. We're also recording environmental predictors at the boards of things that we think may or may not impact gecko presence or absence. And so these are some of our environmental predictors. We're looking at things like canopy cover, both current and in the past, trees with fruits, percent leaf litter, soil temperature, soil moisture, other animal presences, etc. So far what we know, we're still in the process of going out and checking these cover boards, but we've checked them 11 times so far and have seen geckos 30 times. The geckos have been recorded at 17 out of our 81 boards, so that's about 20%. And right now we do not have any significant environmental predictors. So while there aren't any clear correlations with any of the environmental predictors yet, we have only been seeing the geckos in the main hammock and not in the South Addition or in that kind of public access area across 72nd. So this suggests that maybe previous land use history could be an important component of where they're occurring. But again, this is still an ongoing study, so I can't really say anything definitive about that just yet. And so looking towards our next steps, we're hoping to use this novel technique using terrestrial environmental DNA to detect gecko presence. And so you may have heard of eDNA being used in aquatic systems, and recently it's also been used with insects terrestrially. But as far as we know, this would be the first time using it for a land-dwelling vertebrate. And so basically we'll be collecting DNA from the soil under each of the cover boards and seeing whether we can use that to determine whether or not the geckos are present at that location. And so, like I said, it's really hard to find these geckos. So the goal of this is that it would give us an easier kind of more timely way to be able to assess gecko presence and absence and help in conservation efforts for this species. And so to conclude, we would say that the Florida reef gecko conservation status should really be reassessed based on the findings from this study. And we have been in communication with the FWC and are working on submitting a listing petition for this species to be listed in the state of Florida. Protection of hammock sites like the Deering Estate is necessary for conservation of this species, and future studies and ongoing studies are needed to assess microhabitat requirements and genetic structuring. And so with that, I would like to thank my co-authors. A big thank you to Deering Estate and Vanessa, the security team for putting up with our surveys all the time. Dallas for helping us with the placement of all of these cover boards. And of course, Miami-Dade County Parks and Rec, Environmentally Endangered Lands Program, and Florida State Parks. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. We have time for one question before we jump into the next talk. If you could please unmute yourself if you have any questions for Stephanie.
Hi, Stephanie, it's Elise Warren. I just wondered about your thoughts on, since this is such a coastal species, they clearly have survived hurricanes in the past. And I wondered if you've had any thoughts on where your studies might go, or what direction studies would take in order to look at, besides microhabitat adaptations, do you think this species has any specific species-specific adaptations that might help it survive stochastic events like hurricanes?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. One thing I want to mention quickly about the storm surge aspect that I brought up, those models from NOAA is basically like worst case scenario for those categories 1 through 5 storms, like based off of for each of those localities, if the storm were to hit at precisely, whatever angle and all that kind of stuff. So obviously we've had hurricanes in South Florida, and I'm not saying that all of those localities are going to go underwater every time we get a category 3 hurricane. That being said, yeah, so I have not done a lot of work with the actual behavior of the geckos. We do know that they can climb and are occasionally found like up in palms and stuff. So one possibility is that some of them could climb up in the palms to be able to kind of survive these storm surge events. So that would be one possibility. The other thing is that they are found at really high densities. So I think we're more concerned for this species from like a perspective of entire populations basically being wiped out as we lose hammock sites. But if there were such a thing as like, if there's a hurricane at a given location and some of the individuals are able to climb up into the palms, the fact that they have such these really dense populations at the localities where they are found, hopefully that population would eventually be able to bounce back as long as the appropriate habitat were still available for them. Hopefully that somewhat answers your question, but it would be great to have more behavioral studies on this species as well. And I just don't know a whole lot about that at this point. Great question.
Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Elise, for your question, and thank you, Stephanie. Our